Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Doug Lowy. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. I'm going to be focused really on the HPV vaccine, an example of a preventive vaccine that is targeting really an oncogenic infectious agent. But as you just heard from Dr. Hawk, although it is highly speculative, there are opportunities, I think, going forward for preventive vaccines against cancers that may not be attributable to infectious agents. My disclosure is that I'm an inventor of the technology underlying the HPV vaccines, and that technology has been licensed to the two commercial producers, Merck and GlaxoSmithKline. I'm also an inventor of a number of other technologies that have been licensed to a variety of companies. Before getting into HPV vaccination, I want to have one slide on hepatitis B virus vaccination, which universal vaccination was begun in Taiwan now more than 30 years ago. And what this slide depicts for you is that although the highest incidence of liver cancer develops in adults, there is some liver cancer that occurs in relatively young ages. And when you compare the incidence of liver cancer in Taiwan of children at different ages and finally at young adults, there is systematically a decreased incidence of hepatic cancer for these vaccinees compared with non-vaccinees. But importantly, there's a very long interval between the infection and the development of cancer because infectious oncogenic agents take a long time from the infection itself to the development of invasive cancer. And although these interventions have a lot of potential, it takes a while. It's very analogous, actually, to not smoking or for people who smoke. It really takes many years before you actually see the impact of reduction when it comes to cancer. For HPV-associated cancer, globally, we're really talking about cervical cancer. And we have a paradox where it's a largely preventable cancer, but globally it is still common. It is a cancer that disproportionately affects women from poor countries and poor women everywhere. The current high-quality cervical cancer screening and HPV vaccination need to become more cost-effective for their widespread dissemination to less developed regions of the world. This slide depicts for you the predictions from IARC that the number of deaths from women in less developed countries over the next few years is projected to go up substantially, close to 50% over a 15-year period. In the more developed regions, there's much less cervical cancer. And importantly, cervical cancer represents 90% of HPV-associated cancer in the developing world. I'm not showing you the slide, but in the United States, it's a very different picture. Whereas in the developing world, about 95% of HPV-associated cancer occurs in women. In the United States, it's about 60% because we have a much higher incidence of oropharynx cancer than HPV positive, anal cancer, and also to some degree vulvar and vaginal cancers. So global control of cervical cancer and other HPV-associated cancers should soon become feasible. Research for vaccination and screening is likely to lead to changes in standard of care with increased cost effectiveness in the near future. Once that point has been reached, resources are needed to widely implement the interventions. There may currently be sufficient global commitment to marshal these resources. Now, a little bit about the science and performance of the HPV vaccine. This summarizes for you the efficacy of the 3 FDA-approved vaccines from the phase 3 international trials. And what I hope you can appreciate is that their efficacy in women with no genital infection detected at the start of the trial is around 95%. And this is both for precancer, cervical precancer, as well as for genital warts, indicating that the vaccine works both against mucosal infection to prevent it, as well as cutaneous or skin infection to prevent it. It's the first successful vaccine against locally sexually transmitted infection. And in 2016, the 9-valent vaccine, which is the only HPV vaccine available in the United States now, was approved for 2 doses for 9 to 14-year-olds. This shows you data from a few years ago in Australia, which was a high adopter country. I'm showing this to demonstrate that there is dramatic development of herd immunity when there is a high uptake of the vaccine. In Australia, in 2007, about 75% of women of young women received the vaccine, and these are data showing you genital warts as they developed in men over the next few years. And what I hope you can appreciate is that in young men who are heterosexual, their incidence of genital warts plummeted dramatically. Heterosexual men who were over 30, who had much less interaction with vaccinated women, had no change in their incidence, and men between the ages of 21 and 30 were intermediate, statistically significant reduction, but not as dramatic as the men who were 21 or younger. These data were then followed up by showing that there actually is a decrease in the prevalence of the 4 HPV types that are targeted by the quadrivalent vaccine in the population, not just in women, but also in men. In the United States, there's much less uptake of the HPV vaccine, as shown here, 1 dose and either 2 or 3 doses, depending on what was standard of care. And it compares for the other 2 adolescent vaccines, tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis, and then meningococcal vaccine, which are taken up to a much greater degree. Now, 2 last slides to show you that in data from the Costa Rica Vaccine Trial conducted by investigators in Costa Rica and the NCI, we were able to show in post-hoc analyses that 1 dose is not inferior to 3 doses. In green are shown the HPV types not protected by the vaccine, very similar for the women who got either 0 doses, 1, 2, or 3 doses. On the other hand, women, whether they got 1, 2, or 3 doses, the HPV types protected by the vaccine, substantial, similar protection with 1, 2, or 3 doses compared with no doses. Dramatic response is in terms of the serum response. Now 11 years of seropositivity without a decrease, without precedent for a subunit protein-based vaccine, and substantially higher than when there's natural infection. This is shown for HPV vaccine. This is not enough data to change standard of care, but the NCI has initiated a clinical trial for 1 or 2 doses of 2 of the FDA-approved vaccines in Costa Rica again, and these data will eventually show whether 1 dose is sufficient in a rigorous prospective trial to actually become standard of care in the future. Take-home message. Basic research led to identification of HPV as the cause of several cancers and development of the vaccines. They can confer high protection and herd immunity. 2, increased vaccine uptake in the U.S. is needed to achieve personal protection for more individuals and greater herd immunity. 3, control of cervical cancer and other HPV-associated cancers as worldwide public health problems may soon be feasible. Thank you very much.